He failed every math test, no matter the tutor, no matter the cost, until a humble black maid walked into the mansion and changed everything. But when high society mocks the billionaire's choice and secrets from her past threaten to surface, one question remains. Was she ever just a maid, or something far more powerful? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The Hale mansion stood tall and gleaming at the edge of the city, its marble floors echoing with every step, its walls covered in priceless art. But beneath the grandeur was a silence that felt heavier with each passing day. Richard Hale, the man who had built this empire from scratch, was not used to failure. He had grown up poor, clawed his way through boardrooms, and mastered every deal with cold precision. Numbers were his world. Numbers, to him, never lied. They brought order, clarity, power. Which is why it cut him deeper than any business loss to see his 10-year-old son, Michael, stumble every time numbers appeared on a page. Michael sat at the long mahogany desk in his study, his small fingers clutching a pencil, his eyes darting nervously at the sheet of math problems in front of him. Across from him, yet another tutor sighed in exasperation. "Michael, we've been over this 3 times. 7 times 8 is 56. You can't keep forgetting." Michael's cheeks burned as he stared down at the page. The numbers seemed to blur together, refusing to stay in place. I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. From the doorway, Richard's tall frame loomed like a shadow. His jaw tightened, his disappointment filling the room like smoke. "Sorry doesn't change the result," he said sharply. "Do you know how much I'm paying for these lessons? Do you realize what it means when my son, keeps failing basic tests? Do you know how humiliating it is when The tutor shifted uncomfortably, gathering her things. "Mr. Hale, I'll prepare new worksheets for tomorrow. Maybe with more repetition, he'll retain it." Richard nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving Michael. The boy sat frozen, the shame pressing down harder than his father's voice. The tutor left quietly, leaving only the cold silence and Richard's steady, frozen breathing. "Michael," Richard said, his tone low but firm, "you are a Hale. That name means something. It means strength. It means discipline. Do you want to be known as the Hale who couldn't even pass his math exams? Do you want to be the weak link in this?" Tears welled up in Michael's eyes, but he forced himself not to cry. Crying only made things worse. He nodded quickly, whispering, "No, sir." Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Then focus, learn, stop wasting everyone's time." With that, he left, his footsteps echoing down the polished hallway. When the room was empty again, Michael let his shoulders slump, the tears finally spilling down his cheeks. He hated math, he hated numbers. Most of all, he hated the way his father looked at him, like he was broken. It was later that week when Grace Johnson arrived at the mansion. She was not the kind of staff Richard usually hired. She had no polished resume, no recommendation from elite agencies. She had simply walked up to the back entrance of the estate, answered an open call for housekeeping, and been given the job after the previous maid quit abruptly. Grace was in her mid-20s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet strength. She carried herself with dignity despite her simple uniform, her hair neatly tied back, her movements steady and precise. Unlike the other staff who kept their eyes down when Richard passed by, Grace's gaze was calm, steady, and unflinching. She quickly proved herself in the household, her work impeccable, her presence gentle. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when she did, there was warmth in her tone that softened the sharp edges of the mansion. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the study, Grace paused when she noticed Michael hunched over his desk, his head buried in his arms. Papers lay scattered around him, filled with red marks, X's, and notes from his tutor. She hesitated, remembering the instructions she had been given during her first day. "Do your job, stay in your lane. Don't interfere with family matters." But the sight of the small boy trembling silently tugged at her heart. She had seen that look before, on her younger siblings back home, when life had asked too much of them. "Hard day?" she asked gently, her voice soft enough that he could pretend he hadn't heard if he wanted. Michael lifted his head slightly, his eyes red. I'm just stupid," he muttered. Grace's heart clenched. She set down her duster and walked a little closer, careful not to crowd him. "You're not stupid," she said simply. "Obviously, I am," Michael insisted, pushing the papers toward her. "Everyone says I can't learn, I forget everything. Dad says I'm wasting time." Grace glanced at the sheets. Numbers crossed out, answers written and rewritten, mistakes circled in red ink. She could see the effort, the desperate scribbles where he had tried again and again. She remembered her own struggles at school when her teachers assumed she wasn't capable, simply because she came from a poor neighborhood, because her family couldn't afford tutors. She picked up the pencil lying limp on the desk. "May I?" Michael nodded hesitantly. Grace drew a simple picture, a group of apples lined up. "If you have 3 apples here," she said, "and you add 2 more, how many apples do you have?" Michael blinked, staring at the drawing. 5. Grace smiled. "See? That's math. It's not about numbers on a page, it's about the world around you. You already know more than you think." Michael's eyes widened slightly, as if the fog had lifted, just a little. No tutor had ever explained it like that. They just shouted, repeated, or made him memorize. But this made sense. "Can I try another?" he asked, his voice timid but hopeful. Grace nodded. She drew again, using little sketches of stars this time. 4 stars, then 4 more. "What do you see?" Michael counted carefully, his finger moving across the paper. 8. Grace beamed. "Exactly. You're not broken, Michael. You just need someone to show you in a way you understand." For the first time in a long while, Michael smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but real. He whispered, "Thank you." Grace patted his shoulder gently. "You're welcome." She picked up her duster again, returning to her work. But in her heart, she knew something had shifted. Michael watched her leave the room, the warmth of her words lingering long after she was gone. For once, he didn't feel like a failure. The next few days, Grace continued her work quietly, but she noticed Michael seeking her out more often. Whenever she passed by the study, his eyes would flicker toward her, almost asking silently if she would stop and talk. She never imposed, but when he opened the door just a crack as she dusted the hallway, she would smile and say hello. One evening, she found him sitting on the stairs, with a book in his lap. The pages were filled with math problems, and he was chewing his lip nervously. She sat down on the step below him, careful to keep her distance. "Need a partner?" she asked softly. Michael looked up, surprised. You'd help me?" Grace nodded. "If you want me to." He handed her the book hesitantly. "It's just, when I look at the numbers, they don't stay still. They jump around. It's like my brain doesn't want to listen." Grace read the problem aloud, then pulled a few coins from her pocket. She placed them on the step. "Let's try it this way. If you have 5 coins and you spend 2, how many are left?" Michael stared, then moved the coins with his fingers. 3. "Perfect," Grace said, her smile lighting up her face. "You see? You're learning." Michael's chest swelled with pride. For once, he didn't feel like he was disappointing someone. From the landing above, Richard Hale stood in silence, watching the scene unfold. He had returned home earlier than usual, his mind heavy from meetings, only to hear laughter and laughter that he hadn't heard from his son in months. Grace's gentle voice, Michael's tentative giggles, the sight of coins scattered across the stairs, it all struck him in a way he couldn't explain. His first instinct was anger. Why was the maid interfering? Why was Michael wasting time playing games instead of working with the tutor? But another part of him, a part buried deep beneath his perfectionism, felt something else. Relief. Maybe even hope. Still, Richard's pride wouldn't let him admit it. He cleared his throat loudly. Michael froze, the coins slipping from his fingers. Grace stood quickly, her head bowed. "Michael," Richard said, his tone sharp, "what are you doing?" Michael's eyes darted nervously. I was just practicing." Richard's gaze shifted to Grace. With her? Grace swallowed, her hand tightening on her apron. He asked me for help, sir. I only wanted to— Will be all. Richard cut her off coldly. Grace nodded quickly, gathering her things, retreating into the shadows of the hallway. Michael watched her go, his small hands trembling. He wanted to shout, to beg his father not to be angry with her, but the words stuck in his— Richard looked down at his son. The boy's eyes were wide, brimming with unshed tears. Richard sighed, running a hand over his face. Go back to your room, Michael. We'll discuss this later. Michael obeyed silently, his shoulders hunched, his little footsteps echoing up the stairs. Richard stood alone in the hallway, the coins still scattered at his feet. He bent down slowly, picking them up one by one, his mind a storm of emotions he couldn't name. For the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. The next morning, the Hale mansion stirred with the usual rhythm of staff preparing breakfasts, polishing silverware, and moving silently through its vast corridors. Yet in the study, the atmosphere was different. Michael sat at his desk again, staring at another worksheet filled with multiplication and division problems. His pencil tapped nervously against the edge of the page, his shoulders already slumped as if he knew failure was waiting for him. Grace entered quietly, carrying a tray with warm cookies she had baked in the kitchen after finishing her morning chores. She didn't intend to intrude, but when she saw the defeated look on Michael's face, her steps slowed. She remembered the trembling boy from the night before, the coins on the staircase, the small flicker of pride in his eyes when he had solved a problem on his own. That flicker deserved to live again. It looks scary when it's just numbers on paper, Grace said softly, placing the tray on the desk. Michael looked up, startled, then offered a weak smile. I thought you might need some fuel. Thanks, Michael murmured, taking one cookie. He nibbled at it without enthusiasm. Grace sat in the chair beside him, not too close, giving him space. She picked up another cookie and broke it in half. Here's a question, she said lightly. If I have one cookie and I break it into 2 pieces, how many do I have now? Michael blinked, staring at the crumbs in her hand. She nodded. Exactly. But they're still part of one whole cookie. That's division. You just divided one into 2 equal parts. Michael's brow furrowed, then smoothed slowly as understanding dawned. So, division is like sharing? Grace smiled. Exactly. If you and I both wanted half of this cookie, we'd divide it into 2. If you had to share with 3 friends, you'd cut it into 4. That's math too. It's just sharing. Michael's lips curled into a tentative grin. That's not so hard. New, is it? Grace said, handing him the other cookie. And you already knew it. You just needed to see it in a way that made sense. They spent the next half hour breaking cookies, counting crumbs, and even lining them up like soldiers to form addition and multiplication problems. Michael's laughter began to fill the room, bright and unrestrained. For the first time, numbers didn't seem like enemies. They were part of a game, connected to things he could touch, taste, and enjoy. When Richard passed by the study on his way to a call, he paused in the doorway, his brow furrowed at the sight, his son laughing over cookies with the maid. The tutor had quit the night before, complaining about wasted time, yet here was Michael, smiling as if math were no longer a punishment. Richard lingered for a moment, confusion clouding his stern features, before moving on without saying a word. By the end of that day, Michael had solved problems he had previously avoided. They weren't perfect, but his confidence had grown. When Grace left the room to continue her work, Michael kept practicing on his own, humming under his breath like she did while cleaning. The following days brought new methods. Grace introduced chess one afternoon, bringing out the old set she had spotted gathering dust in the library. She explained how pawns moved one square at a time, how bishops moved diagonally, how knights leapt in L shapes. Every move, she told Michael, is about strategy and numbers. If you can learn how many steps each piece can take, you're already practicing math. At first, Michael struggled, his hands fumbling with the carved wooden pieces, but Grace guided him patiently, never raising her voice, never sighing in frustration. It's okay to take time, she reminded him gently. The important thing is trying. Slowly, he began to anticipate her moves, counting spaces ahead, counting in his mind. By the third game, he managed to capture her knight, his eyes lighting up with triumph. "See?" Grace chuckled. "That's math too." Michael grinned, pride swelling in his chest. "I think I like this kind of math." The staff in the mansion began to notice. The boy who once avoided study hours was now found in the library, counting chess pieces, scribbling notes, and even helping Grace measure ingredients in the kitchen to practice fractions. Some of them whispered in disbelief. "What can a maid teach that all those expensive tutors couldn't?" One butler muttered. Another servant shrugged. "Maybe it's because she actually listens to him." Richard overheard some of these murmurs in passing, his jaw tightening. He was skeptical. Surely this improvement was temporary, a phase brought on by novelty. And yet, each evening, when he returned from long meetings, he found Michael a little less defeated, a little more alive. One night, Richard entered the study to find Michael sitting cross-legged on the floor with Grace. They had spread a deck of playing cards between them, turning numbers into quick-fire games of addition and subtraction. Michael's laughter rang through the room as he beat Grace in a round, pumping his fists in victory. Richard stood silently in the doorway, watching, his heart twisted with something unfamiliar. Pride, perhaps, but also shame. Why had it taken a maid, not a father or a tutor, to bring his son this joy? Grace looked up then, catching Richard's gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Hers were calm, unwavering, filled with quiet determination. Richard turned abruptly, leaving without a word, but the image stayed with him long into the night. The more Grace taught, the more Michael grew. Instead of dreading numbers, he now sought them out. During breakfast, he counted strawberries on his plate, subtracting each one as he ate. During walks in the garden, he calculated how many steps it took to cross the path. Numbers were no longer enemies. They were puzzles waiting to be solved. Grace never pushed, never scolded. She made learning a game, weaving lessons into everyday life. When she baked cookies, she asked Michael to measure the flour. "1 cup," she'd say, "but if we need half, how much is that?" He would think carefully, then smile when he found the answer. When they folded laundry together, she turned it into a matching game, asking him to pair socks or count shirts. Slowly, confident, the staff continued whispering. Some disapproved, saying Grace was overstepping her role. "She's a maid, not a tutor," one scoffed. Others, however, began to admire her. "At least the boy is smiling again," the cook whispered to the gardener. "It's been years since we've seen that." Richard observed quietly from the shadows. He never joined, never spoke, but he watched as Michael's grades began to improve. His teachers reported that Michael was participating more, raising his hand in class, even answering correctly. The boy who had once been labeled hopeless was beginning to show potential. One evening, Richard called Michael into his office. The boy entered nervously, clutching his latest test paper in his hands. His father's study was intimidating. Dark wood, leather chairs, shelves lined with business awards. Richard extended his hand silently, and Michael passed him the paper. Richard's eyes scanned the numbers. A B-. Not perfect, but far from failure. He looked up slowly, meeting his son's anxious gaze. For the first time in years, he allowed a small smile. "Better," he said simply. "You're improving." Michael's chest swelled with pride. "Grace helped me," he blurted, then quickly looked down, afraid his father would be angry. Richard paused. The name lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, his mind conflicted. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to claim it was the tutors and schools that had laid the foundation. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the tutors, it wasn't him. It was the maid, the quiet young woman who had dared to care. Later that night, Richard stood in the hallway, watching from a distance as Grace and Michael played chess again. He listened to his son laugh, a sound that had once been rare in this cold mansion. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong, not just about his son, but about what truly mattered. Grace noticed him once more, her eyes meeting his briefly. She didn't bow her head or look away. She simply offered a calm nod, as if to say, "This is how your son learns. This is how he grows." Richard turned away, but something in his heart had shifted. Michael, oblivious to his father's silent presence, continued to count, to laugh, to learn, and for the first time, he believed that maybe numbers were impossible after all. The morning sun streamed through the high glass windows of the Hale mansion, scattering golden light across marble floors and gleaming furniture polished to perfection. The estate always looked immaculate, but in the quiet study tucked in the east wing, there was an unusual hum of energy. Grace sat beside Michael at the wide oak desk, her calm voice steady as she explained a problem using coins laid out in neat little rows. 3 stacks of 4, she said, tapping gently on each group. That's multiplication. What does it give us? Michael frowned, chewed on his lip, then slowly brightened. 12, he shouted with a grin. Grace clapped softly, her smile warm. Exactly. And look, you didn't even need to look at a book. You figured it out yourself. Michael puffed out his chest proudly. I like coins better than numbers on paper. Numbers just stare at me, but coins feel real. Grace chuckled, ruffling his hair. That's the secret. Math isn't scary. It's just the way we count the world around us. Michael laughed too, scooping the coins back into his palm. For a moment, the study was filled with joy, lightness that had long been absent. But as the sound of footsteps echoed sharply across the marble floor, the boys' laughter faltered. The door swung open. Richard Hale stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding in his perfectly pressed suit. His expression was unreadable, but his piercing eyes swept over the desk, taking in the scattered coins, the open book, and the maid leaning far too comfortably close to his son. Michael froze. Grace looked up calmly, though her pulse quickened. Michael, Richard said curtly, go to your room. Michael hesitated, glancing nervously between his father and Grace. But father? Now, Richard repeated, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. The boy's shoulders slumped. Without another word, he gathered the coins and shuffled out, his footsteps reluctant. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving silence in its wake. Richard's gaze shifted back to Grace. His voice was cold, laced with accusation. What exactly do you think you're doing? Grace straightened in her seat, folding her hands in her lap. Helping him? You are a maid, Richard said, his voice cutting. Your duty is to clean, cook, and manage the household, not to meddle in my son's education. Grace inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had expected this confrontation eventually. With all due respect, sir, I didn't meddle. Michael came to me, he needed help, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Richard's jaw tightened. That is not your place. I have spent thousands on tutors, on specialists, on the finest schools. Do you presume to think you can succeed where they failed? Grace's voice softened, but her eyes didn't waver. No, sir, I don't presume. I simply listened. Michael doesn't need more pressure, more charts, more drills. He needs patience. He needs someone to believe in him. The words struck Richard like a slap. He had heard similar accusations before, from his late wife, from teachers, from anyone who dared to suggest his strict methods were suffocating. But hearing them now, from a maid of all people, stirred a dangerous mix of anger and unease. You think I don't believe in my son? Richard's voice rose, echoing against the walls. Everything I've done has been for him, for his future, for his success. Failure is not an option in this family. Grace's heart ached at the sharpness in his tone. She could imagine how often Michael had heard those words, how heavy they must have felt on the boy's small shoulders. Sir, she said carefully, what Michael hears isn't belief. He hears disappointment. Every time he struggles, he sees the way you look at him, like he's already failed. That's what's crushing him, not the math problems. Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His pride bristled, stung by the truth she dared to speak. You overstep, Grace. Do not confuse your compassion for Grace swallowed, her voice firm but respectful. Maybe so, but tell me, did any of those experts make him laugh? Did any of them make him proud of himself, even for a moment? Richard's breath caught. He had no answer, because he knew she was right. He had seen the change in his son, even if he hadn't wanted to admit it, yet his pride refused to yield. Before he could reply, a sound interrupted them. A small sniffle. Both turned toward the door. Michael stood there, clutching the edge of the frame, tears brimming in his eyes. His voice trembled. "Please, Father, don't take Grace away." The room fell into heavy silence. Richard's chest tightened at the sight of his son's tears. Michael rarely cried, not openly, not since his mother had passed. But now, the boy stood there, vulnerable and afraid, pleading with him in a way that pierced through every wall he had built. Grace's heart broke too, but she remained still, letting Michael speak. "This makes me feel like I can do it," Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "Like I'm not stupid. Like I'm not a failure." Richard's face paled. The words hit him harder than any accusation Grace could have spoken. He had never realized his son thought of himself that way, never allowed himself to see the damage his relentless expectations had caused. For a long moment, the powerful billionaire stood frozen, his pride and his guilt clashing inside him. His son's tears, Grace's quiet defiance, the echo of his late wife's words, all of it swirled together like a storm breaking open. Richard finally exhaled, his voice lower, heavier. "Go to your room, Michael. We'll talk later." Michael lingered, eyes wide with fear, before retreating reluctantly down the hall. The door closed again, leaving Richard and Grace in tense silence. Grace rose from her seat slowly. She didn't look triumphant. There was no victory in making a child cry. Her voice was quiet, steady. "He doesn't need perfection, Mr. Hale. He needs you." Richard's throat tightened, but he said nothing. His pride still held him captive, though deep inside, the cracks had already begun to form. That night, the mansion felt colder than usual. Dinner was eaten in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound echoing across the long, mahogany table. Michael pushed his food around his plate, his appetite gone. Grace, stationed discreetly near the sideboard, kept her eyes lowered, though her heart ached with every glance at the boy's downcast face. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression uneven, but his mind churned restlessly. He remembered the desperation in his son's voice, the tears streaking his cheeks. He remembered Grace's words, gentle yet piercing, that had struck at truths he had long avoided. Later, when the staff had cleared the dishes and the mansion fell into quiet, Richard found himself pacing his study. He tried to lose himself in spreadsheets and contracts, but every column of numbers blurred into the memory of his son's trembling plea. "Please don't take Grace away." Finally, unable to resist, he stepped into the hallway and paused outside Michael's room. The faint glow of a lamp seeped through the crack under the door. Slowly, he pushed it open. Inside, Michael lay curled on the bed, his coins still scattered on the blanket. He was whispering quietly to himself, practicing multiplication problems Grace had taught him. Richard's chest constricted. He wanted to step forward, to praise his son, to tell him he was proud, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by years of pride and distance. Instead, he closed the door silently, leaning against the wall outside with a heavy sigh. The next morning, Grace found herself summoned to Richard's office. She entered cautiously, unsure of what to expect. He sat behind the large desk, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the papers before him. "You've caused quite a stir," he said finally, his voice clipped. Grace clasped her hands together, steadying herself. "If I've done wrong, I'll accept whatever consequences you see fit. But I will not apologize for helping Michael." Richard's eyes lifted to hers, sharp and assessing. "You speak boldly for someone in your position." Grace met his gaze without flinching. "Because he matters, and if I have to risk my position to remind you of that, so be it." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Richard saw not just a maid, but a woman of quiet strength, someone unafraid to stand her ground for the sake of a child. His pride warred with reluctant respect, leaving him caught in the middle. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling. "I don't know what you've done, but he's different, happier, more confident, and I don't understand why." Grace's tone softened. "Because I don't see him as a reflection of you, Mr. Hale. I see him as Michael, a boy who needs patience, kindness, and time. Not numbers on a report card, not proof of your legacy, just..." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Richard's throat tightened. He thought of his late wife again, of her endless pleas for him to be gentler, for him to see their son as more than his grades. For years he had ignored her. Now, standing before Grace, he realized how wrong he had been. He pressed his fingers to his temple, closing his eyes. "You have no idea how difficult it is to balance a company, a fortune, and a family." Grace's reply was soft but unwavering. "Maybe so, but none of that will matter if you lose him." Richard opened his eyes, staring at her. Her words sank deep, breaking through the fortress of pride he had built around himself. He didn't respond, but in that silence, something shifted. From that day, though he never admitted it aloud, Richard allowed Grace to continue working with Michael. He never praised her, never thanked her, but he stopped interfering. And slowly, quietly, he began to watch with new eyes, seeing not just the boy struggling with numbers, but the boy beginning to believe in himself again. For the first time in years, Richard Hale realized he had something to learn. Not about math, but about love, patience, and the courage to see beyond his pride. The school bell rang loudly across the courtyard, scattering children in every direction like colorful birds freed from a cage. Some shouted gleefully, others hurried toward waiting cars, while a few clutched their backpacks tightly, faces etched with the weight of exams taken that day. Among them was Michael Hale. His small hands gripped the folded test paper so tightly the edges began to crumple, but his grin stretched. For the first time in years, the numbers on the page weren't a source of shame, they were proof of triumph. 78%, he whispered under his breath, reading the red ink scribbled at the top of the sheet. To anyone else, it was an average score. To him, it was a victory as bright as a trophy. His teachers had doubted, his classmates had mocked, even his father had sighed with disappointment. But today, he held something tangible in his hands, something that said he wasn't a failure. He had passed. Obviously, as he climbed into the family's black town car, the driver glanced at the paper and offered a rare smile. "That looks important, young master." Michael nodded eagerly, his heart pounding. "Can you take me straight home? I need to show Grace." The ride felt endless, but when the gates of the Hale mansion finally swung open, Michael bolted out of the car before it had fully stopped. He dashed up the marble steps, nearly tripping over his backpack straps, and burst into the grand hall. "Grace!" he shouted, his voice echoing. "Grace, where are you?" From the far end of the corridor, Grace Johnson appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Her brows furrowed at his frantic tone, but when she saw his glowing face, she stopped. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Michael thrust the paper into her hands, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Look what I did." Grace unfolded the crumpled sheet carefully, scanning the numbers and the grade at the top. Her lips parted, her eyes shining as they met his. "Michael," she whispered, "you passed." "Did it?" he exclaimed, his voice trembling with excitement. "I finally passed a math test." In that moment, Grace crouched down to his level and pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she murmured against his hair. "Not because of the score, but because you never gave up. You kept trying, even when it was hard. That's what matters." Michael clung to her, relief washing through him in waves. For so long, failure had been his companion, but now he had proof that he could overcome it. And the first person he wanted to share it with wasn't his teachers, not his classmates, not even his father. It was Grace, the woman who had believed in him when no one else had. The sound of deliberate footsteps echoed down the hall. Both turned to see Richard Hale approaching, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He glanced between the maid kneeling on the marble floor and his son, clutching a piece of paper with trembling hands. "What's going on?" Richard asked, his tone brisk but tinged with curiosity. Michael's chest puffed with pride. "Father, look, I passed my math test." He held out the paper eagerly, his eyes searching for approval. Richard took it, scanning the page with sharp eyes. 78%. Not perfect, not exceptional, but for a boy who had failed every test before, it was a leap across an invisible canyon. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. His jaw tightened, the silence stretching until Michael's smile faltered slightly. Grace rose slowly, her eyes fixed on Richard, silently willing him to see what this meant. Finally, Richard exhaled and looked at his son. "You did better," he said softly. Michael's face lit up again, as though the words were gold. "I worked really hard," he insisted. "Grace helped me. She made it fun. I wasn't scared this time." Richard's gaze flicked to Grace. Her posture was calm, her hands folded, but her eyes were steady, daring him to dismiss her role. The weight of realization settled heavily on his chest. He had hired world-class tutors, spent fortunes on private lessons, demanded excellence with no excuses. And all it took was this woman, a maid with patience and warmth, to achieve what his wealth never could. The thought unsettled him, even stung. His pride warred with gratitude, a storm brewing beneath his composed surface. He handed the paper back to Michael, his voice lower now. "I'm glad you did well. Keep it up." Michael beamed, running off toward the garden, shouting to the staff about his success. His laughter echoed through the mansion like music. Richard remained in the hall, his eyes still fixed on Grace. "What did you tell him?" he asked finally. Grace tilted her head slightly. "The truth? To what truth is that?" "He's not a failure," she replied simply. "That numbers don't decide his worth, that learning takes time and patience, and that someone believes he can do it." Richard's brow furrowed, the words slicing deeper than he wanted to admit. "You think all my efforts, all my investments, mean nothing?" Grace shook her head gently. "They mean something, sir, but money can buy tutors, not trust. It can buy lessons, not laughter. You can't purchase love or patience, no matter how many zeros are in your bank account." Michael needed someone to see him, not the grades, not the Hale name, just him. Her voice was calm, not confrontational, but the truth of it settled heavily in the vast hall. Richard found himself silent, for once without a rebuttal. His wealth had built empires, but it had not been enough to build a bridge to his son. Grace lowered her gaze respectfully and excused herself, leaving Richard standing alone with thoughts that gnawed at his pride. As Michael's laughter carried faintly from the garden, Richard felt a hollow ache inside. He had always believed money solved everything, but maybe, just maybe, this maid was right. Later that evening, the mansion seemed brighter. Michael chattered endlessly through dinner, recounting every detail of the test, how he had remembered the coins Grace had used, how he pictured cookies divided into groups, how he had even corrected a classmate on a problem. The boy's eyes sparkled, his voice full of energy as though a weight had been lifted from his small shoulders. Richard listened quietly, sipping his wine, but his gaze often wandered to Grace, who stood discreetly by the dining room doors. She didn't bask in the praise or draw attention to herself. Instead, she watched Michael with quiet satisfaction, her smile gentle and unassuming. When dinner ended and Michael was sent to bed, Richard found himself lingering in the study, the folded test paper lying on his desk. He stared at the 78 circled at the top. Not a perfect score, but it meant more than any flawless grade could. It was proof of progress, of courage. And it hadn't been achieved by expensive tutors or elite institutions. It had been achieved by the woman who scrubbed his floors and polished his silverware. The thought unsettled him deeply. Grace entered quietly to collect a tray of empty glasses. Richard glanced up. "Why didn't he come to me first?" Grace paused, meeting his eyes. "Because he was afraid of what you'd say." The words hit like a blade. Richard leaned back in his chair, his throat tight. "Afraid?" "Yes," Grace said gently. "He thought you'd see the mistakes instead of the progress. He thought you'd remind him he wasn't good enough. So he came to me, because he knew I'd celebrate his effort, not just his result." Richard's chest tightened. He remembered his own father, the harsh expectations, the punishments for anything less than perfect. He had sworn never to be weak, never to allow mediocrity, and now, unknowingly, he had passed that burden onto his son. "Would you bother?" he asked suddenly, his tone rough. "You're not paid to teach. You're not responsible for his failures." Grace placed the tray down, her voice steady. "Because I care. Because no child should grow up believing they are worthless. Because Michael needed someone to believe in him. And because—" She hesitated, then continued softly. "Because I know what it feels like to be told you'll never be enough." Her admission startled him. For the first time, Richard looked at her not as staff, but as a person, a woman with a past, with wounds of her own. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Richard leaned forward, his voice quieter, almost reluctant. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been—" Grace gave a faint smile. "It's never too late to see, Mr. Hale. Michael doesn't need perfection from you. He just needs you." The words lingered long after she left the room. Richard stared at the test paper again, but now he saw more than numbers. He saw his son's hope, Grace's faith, and his own failings reflected back at him. For the first time in years, Richard Hale felt something shift inside him. Not defeat, not pride, but the stirrings of humility. And as he extinguished the lamp that night, he knew one truth he could no longer ignore. Money had built his empire, but love would be the only thing to save his son. The news began as a murmur in school corridors, drifting from parent to parent like the faint rustle of silk gowns in a ballroom. At first it was harmless curiosity. Someone had overheard Michael excitedly telling a friend that Grace makes math easy with cookies and stories. But within days, curiosity turned into whispers. Parents from the elite circle that surrounded the Hale family could not resist a story dripping with irony. The son of one of the richest men in the state learning from a maid. It spread fastest at the weekly social gatherings, where Richard's peers gathered over champagne and polished silver platters. One sharply dressed mother leaned toward her companion, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard. "Can you believe it? The billionaire's heir being taught arithmetic by the help." "What's next? His Latin from the gardener?" Laughter rippled across the group, and though their tones were amused, there was venom beneath the polish. Another father smirked as he swirled his drink. "I suppose when your fortune buys you everything, you forget to demand excellence at home." A maid? Really? If Richard can't manage his own child, what does that say about the empire he's supposed to run? Every word was designed to slice, to undermine, to turn Richard's proud name into a punchline. The cruelty spread like ink in water, staining not just the father, but the boy who bore his name. Teachers at Michael's school began whispering too, some amused, others skeptical. A few even hinted that Grace might be overstepping her role, taking liberties beyond her station. Grace, of course, became the target of quieter, sharper gossip within the mansion itself. Servants who had once ignored her now cast sidelong glances, their words dripping with mockery. "She thinks she's special just because the boy likes her stories," one maid whispered to another in the kitchen. "Wait until Mr. Hale realizes she's tried to climb above her. I heard she spends more time in the study than in the laundry," another added with a sniff. "Imagine that, as if cleaning isn't enough for her." Grace pretended not to hear. She polished the banisters, folded the linens, and prepared Michael's small math games with quiet precision. Yet the words dug deep, each one a reminder of how fragile her position was. She was not blind. She knew her role in this house was not supposed to extend beyond sweeping floors and dusting furniture, but every time Michael looked at her with shining eyes and asked if she would help him with another problem, she knew she could not step back. Whispers grew crueler when Michael's progress became obvious. His teacher reported that he was more confident in class, raising his hand to answer questions he once avoided. Instead of celebrating, the elite families found new reasons to sneer. "Confidence built on crumbs," one parent muttered. "Grace Johnson is a maid, not a mathematician. What happens when the boy reaches algebra? Will she bake pies to solve?" Grace overheard such remarks one afternoon when she accompanied Michael to the library. Two mothers stood near the shelves, their pearls gleaming under the chandelier as their laughter echoed softly. Grace's back stiffened, her cheeks burning. She turned away before they could see the pain in her eyes, gripping Michael's small hand more tightly. He didn't notice. He was too busy chattering about the book he wanted to borrow. That night, alone in her modest room tucked behind the servants' quarters, Grace sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She pulled from her pocket the scrap of paper on which Michael had proudly drawn their cookie division method. The crooked circles and uneven fractions were hardly perfect, but they meant something far greater than polished ink on a test page. They were proof that he was learning, that he was brave enough to try. And no whisper from the outside world could strip that away. The following morning, she returned to her duties with her usual grace. She tied her apron, swept the marble halls, and hummed softly as she passed McLow's study. He looked up, his face breaking into a grin. "Grace, can we practice the chess?" Her heart softened, the bitterness of the gossip fading under his joy. "Of course," she said, "but only if you promise to finish your reading first." Richard Hale watched this quiet exchange from the top of the staircase. He had overheard the whispers at his clubs, the mockery at board meetings, the sly remarks about how the great Richard Hale had let a servant handle what elite tutors could not. At first his instinct had been to rage against it, to silence the rumors. Yet as he saw his son's face beam with genuine excitement, he felt something shift. The dignity with which Grace carried herself, even under the weight of scorn, did not go unnoticed. That evening, as he retreated to his study, Richard found himself replaying the words he had heard earlier. If Richard can't manage his own child, what does that say about the empire he's supposed to run? The insult lingered, but so did another truth. Grace had achieved something he, with all his power, had failed to do. She had given Michael back his confidence. The storm of gossip did not end. It grew sharper. At a charity dinner held in one of the city's glittering hotels, Richard arrived with Michael at his side. Grace accompanied discreetly, more in the background, but the murmurs followed her every step. The miracle tutor. Eyes narrowing at the sight of the maid in her simple uniform. The miracle tutor. Imagine the scandal, another chuckled. What kind of billionaire parades a servant as his son? Grace kept her gaze lowered, her movements precise and unassuming. She poured water when asked, fetched a napkin when Michael spilled soup, and smiled gently whenever the boy leaned against her arm. But every whisper reached her ears, slicing into her resolve. Michael, too, began to sense the hostility. During dessert, he whispered, "Grace, why are they staring at you?" She brushed his hair gently, forcing a smile. "Because they don't understand us, sweetheart, but you and I know the truth, and that's enough." Richard, seated nearby, overheard. His jaw tightened as he scanned the room, catching the judgment in the eyes of his so-called peers. For the first time, their mockery felt less like an attack on his reputation and more like an insult to the woman who had stood steadfast. Back at the mansion, he called Grace into his study. She stood silently as he paced, the firelight flickering across his face. Finally, he spoke. "I've heard what they're saying about you." Grace nodded, her hands folded calmly. "So have I, sir." "We mock my son," Richard continued bitterly. "They mock me. But most of all, they mock you." Grace lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady. "Let them?" His brows furrowed. "You don't care?" "Of course I care," she said quietly. "But caring doesn't mean I stop. Michael needs me. He's learning, he's smiling again. That matters more than whispers over champagne." Richard froze, studying her. The fire cracked in the hearth, filling the silence. She stood there, composed, dignified, her words simple but unshakable. Something inside him stirred, a reluctant respect, an admiration he had not expected. "Do you carry yourself well?" he admitted finally. Grace inclined her head. "Because I know why I'm here. Not for them. For him." The conversation ended there, but it lingered with Richard long into the night. For a man who had built his empire on appearances, on carefully crafted images of power, seeing Grace stand strong beneath ridicule shook something deep within him. Days passed, and the whispers did not die, but Richard's perception had changed. Every time he saw Grace patiently working with Michael, every time he saw her endure a passing sneer without flinching, his silent admiration deepened. She was not only teaching his son numbers, she was teaching both of them something far greater, the sweetening of quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. Though he never admitted it aloud, Richard Hale found himself more unsettled by that truth than by any rumor whispered in polished halls. The invitation came quietly, almost as an afterthought, slipped into the usual correspondence from Michael's school. But to Grace, it was anything but ordinary. She had been asked by name to attend the parent-teacher meeting alongside Richard Hale. At first she thought it must have been a mistake. Maids did not attend such meetings, and certainly not in schools filled with children from the city's most prestigious. Yet when she tentatively handed the envelope to Richard, expecting him to frown and dismiss it, she was surprised by her silence. He studied the letter for a long moment, then looked at her with something unreadable in his expression. "You want you there," he said finally, his voice low. "And perhaps they are right." Grace did not argue. She knew better than to question the fragile shifts in Richard's demeanor. For weeks, she had noticed the way his eyes lingered on Michael whenever the boys solved a math problem, the way his stiff shoulders relaxed ever so slightly when laughter spilled from the study. But she also knew his pride was a wall as tall as the mansion itself, and climbing it would take more than whispered encouragements and fractions turned into gain. The day of the meeting, Grace arrived at the school, dressed as simply as ever. Plain blouse, clean skirt, shoes polished until they gleamed. She felt the weight of curious stares the moment she entered the marble lobby. Other parents clad in designer suits and silk dresses whispered behind manicured hands. "Isn't she the maid?" one murmured. "Why would Hale bring her here?" Another smirked. "Perhaps he's making a statement about humility. Or perhaps he's lost his mind." Grace lowered her gaze, steadying her breath, but Michael's small hand slipped into hers with quiet certainty. He had insisted she sit beside him in the car, and now he tugged her gently forward, as if to say he didn't care what anyone else thought. Richard followed a step behind, his towering frame and commanding presence silencing many of the whispers. Yet Grace noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of defiance and uncertainty, as though he too was grappling with what this moment meant. Inside the classroom, the teachers greeted them warmly. Michael's homeroom teacher, a woman with kind eyes and a steady voice, gestured toward a row of chairs. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming. We have much to discuss, but all of it good." Michael beamed, bouncing slightly in his seat as if unable to contain the secret he already knew. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart swelling. The teacher began, with gentle formality, flipping through Michael's latest assignments. "We've seen remarkable progress these past months. His test scores have risen steadily, but more than that, his confidence has blossomed. He participates in class discussions, he volunteers answers, and even when he makes mistakes, he no longer shuts down. Whoever has been guiding him has done so with a rare understanding of both his mind and his heart." Her gaze shifted, deliberately, toward Grace. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Richard's eyes followed, sharp and searching, and Grace felt heat rush to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to deflect, to insist she was only helping a little, but Michael interrupted with childlike certainty. "Grace makes numbers fun," he said proudly. "She teaches me with cookies and chess and stories. I don't hate math anymore because of her." The words landed with the force of truth, undeniable and pure. Grace blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears. Across the table, Richard inhaled sharply, his polished mask faltering. He had built an empire on numbers, on precision, on results bought with wealth. Yet his son's first success had not come from any of those things. It had come from a woman with no degree, no wealth, only patience and love. When the meeting ended and Michael skipped ahead to show Grace a drawing he had made in art class, Richard lingered in the empty hallway with her. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile, until he finally spoke. "You understand you," he admitted, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You step into a life you don't belong to, you endure their whispers, and yet you stand tall. You give my son what I, with all my resources, could not. And I don't know how to reconcile that." Grace hesitated, her heart pounding. She had never heard him speak with such vulnerability, such naked honesty. Carefully, she replied, "Perhaps it's not about reconciling, Mr. Hale. Perhaps it's about seeing." Michael never needed riches or pressure. He needed someone to listen, to care, to make him believe he wasn't a failure. That's all. Her words cut deeper than any accusation. Richard turned away, staring at the polished floor. "Do you know what it feels like?" he said quietly. "To hold everything in your hands, power, influence, fortune, and still feel utterly helpless in the face of your own child's pain." Grace's throat tightened. Slowly she nodded. "I know what it feels like to have nothing in your hands, not even certainty for the next meal, and still feel responsible for your siblings' futures. I worked nights in diners, mornings cleaning houses, afternoons tutoring neighborhood children, all to keep them in school. Sometimes love means giving when you have nothing left to give." Her voice softened, steady but unshakable. "You think you're failing, Mr. Hale, but the fact that you're asking yourself these questions means you're not. Michael doesn't need perfection, he needs presence, and you can give him that if you choose to." For the first time in years, Richard felt the walls around his heart shift, as though her words had found a crack in the stone. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the maid who cleaned his house, but the woman who had carried burdens heavier than wealth could ever erase. And something unfamiliar stirred inside him, a fragile respect that bordered on something more. The car ride back from the school was unusually quiet. Michael dozed in the back seat, his test papers clutched tightly in his hands. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the passing skyline. Richard's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he wrestled with thoughts that refused to settle. He had faced corporate takeovers, lawsuits, and political scandals, but nothing unnerved him more than the realization that he was beginning to depend on the presence of a woman he had once dismissed as inconsequential. When they returned to the mansion, Grace excused herself quickly. Richard remained in his study long after Michael had gone to bed, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. Her words echoed in his mind. Love means giving when you have nothing left to give. He wondered when he had last done that for his son. The following days brought small but significant changes. Richard began joining Michael and Grace during their study sessions, at first standing silently in the doorway, later sitting nearby under the pretense of reviewing documents. He watched as Grace patiently explained concepts with cookies or chess pieces, never raising her voice, never allowing frustration to show. And he saw Michael light up under her encouragement, his laughter spilling freely in a way Richard had rarely heard before. One evening, as the boy raced upstairs to fetch a book, Richard found himself alone with Grace at the dining table. The silence was thick, but he broke it with a question that had lingered unspoken. "You said you worked to put your siblings through school. Did you succeed?" Grace looked at him, surprised. Slowly she nodded. "Two of them finished college. The youngest is still in high school. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Every shift I took, every sleepless night, it was all worth it when I saw them walk across that stage." Richard studied her, his chest tightening. "You gave them what I couldn't give my own son. Sacrifice, patience, a kind of love that doesn't measure in numbers or results." Grace shook her head softly. "Don't underestimate yourself. Michael loves you. He just fears you too. That can change." The honesty in her voice struck him harder than any criticism from his peers. For once, Richard didn't respond with anger or pride. Instead, he whispered, "How do you do it, Grace? How do you carry so much weight and still find the strength to smile?" Her answer was simple. "Because if I don't, who will? Life gave me no choice but to be strong, and maybe that's why Michael trusts me. He sees I won't break, even when the world tells me I should." In that moment, Richard felt something break inside him. Not weakness, but release. He had spent years building walls of steel around himself, believing vulnerability was a liability. Yet here was a woman who had nothing, who dared to speak with more strength than any boardroom executive he had ever faced. And it humbled him. Over the next weeks, their bond grew in quiet ways. Shared cups of tea after Michael went to bed. Brief conversations about books, about life, about what it meant to lose and still keep going. For Grace, it was disarming to see glimpses of the man beneath the billionaire's mask, a father aching for redemption. For Richard, it was a revelation to realize that the woman society mocked as a maid might be the only person who truly understood what it meant to fight for someone else's. The barriers between them, once rigid and unyielding, had begun to crumble, and though neither dared name it yet, both knew something had shifted. Forever. The storm did not come from the sky. It came from polished boardrooms, echoing dining halls, and the sneering voices of a society that measured worth not in love or patience but in pedigree and prestige. The moment news slipped out that Richard Hale's son was improving academically under the guidance of not another Oxford-edited tutor or Harvard-certified specialist, but under the gentle hands of Grace Johnson. The maid, the whispers, they grew louder with every passing week, until they crashed down on Richard with the force of a tide he could no longer ignore. It began with the board. Hale Enterprises thrived on reputation as much as numbers, and the members of the board were ruthless in guarding that image. At the quarterly meeting, amid discussions of acquisitions and quarterly profits, one silver-mailed man cleared his throat and shifted the conversation like a blade slipping between ribs. "Richard," he said smoothly, "there are concerns, personal matters bleeding into professional optics." His eyes gleamed. The matter of your son's education. Richard, sitting tall at the head of the table, lifted his gaze from the reports. His expression was unreadable. What of it? Another board member, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper investments, leaned forward. It has reached the ears of investors that your son's academic progress, commendable as it is being attributed to the household maid. Do you understand how that sounds, Richard? A Hale heir, tutored by staff instead of professionals? It makes you appear careless, weak. Around the table, others murmured in agreement. One man tapped his pen against his notepad, adding, "This is not about the child's grades, it's about optics. Replacing a team of certified experts with a maid makes you look irresponsible, even eccentric. Investors want stability, not sentiment." Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. He let the words circle him, the criticism cloaked in polished phrasing, the disdain too thinly veiled to mistake. Finally he spoke, his voice cool but edged with steel. "My son is thriving. He laughs, he engages, he learns. For years, experts failed to reach him. Grace Johnson did in months what they could not in years. You call that weakness. I call it results." A ripple of discomfort passed through the boardroom, but the woman smirked, unfazed. "Love and games may be charming, Richard, but they do not prepare a child to inherit a fortune or run an empire. Be careful not to confuse affection with adequacy. If you want the Hales to maintain their standing, the boy must be taught by people who belong in our world, not by someone who dusts your shelves." Were hung in the air, heavy and cruel. For a moment, Richard felt the sting of them. Not for himself, but for Grace, who had never asked to be thrust into this glare, who had only ever wanted to help a lonely boy believe in himself. He wanted to lash out, but years of training in self-control tethered his temper. He dismissed the meeting swiftly, but the seed of fury had already been planted deep in his chest. The pressure did not end there. His own family soon joined the chorus. At a formal dinner, his sister Olivia lifted her glass with false grace and said, "Richard, darling, surely you're not serious about this arrangement. A maid in place of qualified experts? People are talking." She leaned closer, her perfume suffocating. "Think of Michael. He will be mocked. Children can be cruel, and society Do you want him branded the boy whose father traded tutors for a servant's lullabies?" Richard set his glass down with deliberate calm. Michael is no longer failing every test. He is no longer afraid of numbers. For the first time in years, he comes home eager to learn. If that is the result of lullabies, then perhaps we should have tried them sooner. Olivia's painted smile faltered, but she pressed on. "You cannot be blind to what this looks like. It undermines everything. Appearances matter." Richard met her gaze, his voice low but resolute. Appearances built this family's empire, but appearances never comforted a child crying over a failed test. Appearances never taught him to laugh again. The dinner ended in brittle silence, but Richard did not care. He had begun to realize that defending Grace was no longer merely about gratitude, it was about principle. Yet even as he steeled himself, he worried for her. The whispers had reached her ears too. Grace heard them first among the staff. Walking through the mansion's corridors, she caught fragments carried on careless tongues. "She's getting above herself. Does she think she's mistress of the house? He'll drop her when it suits him. You'll see." The words cut not because she believed them, but because she knew how easily others might. She endured them silently, focusing only on Michael. When he stumbled, she encouraged. When he grew frustrated, she steadied. She reminded herself she had promised to endure whispers for his sake. But the hardest moment came one afternoon when Michael himself overheard. The boy had crept downstairs in search of Grace when he caught two staff members muttering near the kitchen. "The maid will be gone soon," one sneered. "The boy won't allow this nonsense much longer. The boy's father will come to his senses." Michael froze, his small fists clenching. When Grace found him moments later, he was trembling. "Are they right?" he whispered. "Will you leave me too?" Grace knelt, pulling him close. "Michael, listen to me. I am not going anywhere unless you want me to. Do you understand? People say cruel things when they don't understand. But none of that matters. What matters is you." Tears brimmed in his eyes, and for the first time he clung to her with desperate strength. "I don't want anyone else. I want you." It was that moment that Richard walked in, having returned early from a meeting. He stopped, unseen, in the doorway, listening to his son's broken plea and Grace's gentle assurances. Something shifted irrevocably inside him. He had known, in theory, that Grace had changed Michael's life, but to see his son cling to her, to hear him beg not to lose her, it stripped away the last vestiges of doubt. That night, Richard made a decision. He would no longer allow whispers or optics to dictate the course of his son's happiness. If society demanded a fight, then he would fight, and for once, not for profit or pride, but for love. The reckoning came sooner than expected. Richard had been invited to a charity gala, one of those glittering affairs where fortunes were flaunted and reputations weighed in champagne glasses and whispered scandals. Grace had hesitated to attend, but Michael, eager to show her drawings to the world, had tugged her along. She arrived in a simple dress, her hair neatly tied back, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. Yet even her stillness drew attention. Whispers spread quickly. "That's her too, Maid? He brought her here? Bold, isn't it? Disgraceful, really." Grace tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Michael, who proudly held her hand as he darted from one corner to another. Richard kept close, but he could hear every word, every hiss of disdain aimed at the woman who had given his son back his smile. When the evening's speeches began, Richard was called to the stage. He spoke briefly of charity, of legacy, of the responsibilities of wealth, but as he prepared to step down, his gaze caught Grace's in the crowd. Behind her stood Michael, clutching her hand, his face glowing with trust, and in that instant, Richard made a choice. He turned back to the microphone. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "Some of you have questioned the role of a certain woman in my household. You have whispered that she is unfit, unworthy, that she does not belong in the world of the Hales. Tonight, I will answer you plainly." The room hushed. Curiosity sharpened into silence. Richard's voice deepened, steady and unflinching. "For years, my son suffered. Tutors failed, experts failed, and I, in all my power, failed him too. But one woman did not. Grace Johnson. She reached him when no one else could. She gave him not just knowledge, but laughter. Not just lessons, but courage. And because of her, my son no longer fears the world." Gasps echoed through the hall. Grace's eyes widened, her breath catching as every gaze turned toward her, but Richard was not finished. "You ask me if it is proper for a maid to teach the heir of this family. I tell you this, titles mean nothing when weighed against the love and patience that save a child's heart. Appearances mean nothing when set beside the truth of a boy's smile. Grace is not just a maid, she is the reason my son believes in himself again, and I will defend her as fiercely as I defend him." The applause did not come immediately. Shock held the room too tightly. But then, from the edge of the stage, a small voice broke the silence. Michael had tugged free from Grace's hand, climbing onto the first step of the platform. His eyes, bright with determination, turned toward the crowd. "It is my mama Grace," he declared, his voice clear and trembling with courage. "She's not just the maid, she's my mama too." The words fell like a thunderclap. Grace's hands flew to her mouth as tears flooded her eyes. The audience gasped, whispers colliding into chaos, but Richard bent down, scooping his son into his arms. His voice shook as he said into the microphone, "And that is all that matters." This time, applause rose. Hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder, as some in the crowd, moved by the child's courage, stood to their feet. Grace wept openly, her dignity unshaken even in tears. Richard stepped down from the stage, carrying his son, and placed him gently back beside her. Without hesitation, Michael grasped her hand again. From that night onward, the whispers did not stop, but they no longer mattered. Richard had made his choice, not just privately, but publicly, in the full glare of society's scrutiny. Grace remained, stronger than ever, by Michael's side, and though battles still lay ahead, the bond between them had been sealed in the only way that mattered, with truth, with love, with courage shouted in a child's trembling voice. The seasons changed, and with them so did the Hale mansion. Once it had been a house of silence, where the ticking of antique clocks echoed more loudly than any child's laughter, and where cold marble floors bore witness to more business calls than embraces. Now, sunlight lingered in the windows longer, as though reluctant to leave the rooms filled with something rare. Michael, once the boy who dreaded numbers, now carried notebooks brimming with solved equations, doodles of shapes turned into smiling faces, and even puzzles he made up on his own. His teacher's notes came home, filled with words like "excellent progress" and "a joy to teach." Yet beyond the grades, his confidence shone brighter than any certificate. Where once he hunched over, terrified of making mistakes, now he grinned as he explained multiplication tricks to the cook, or challenged the chauffeur to riddles about fractions. Grace was at the center of it all. She no longer carried herself with the cautious steps of a maid afraid to overstep. Instead, she moved like someone who belonged, not because of a title, but because of love. She still did chores, still rolled up her sleeves when needed, but she was no longer merely staff. She was the heartbeat of the house. The staff, who once whispered cruel remarks, now looked at her differently. They saw that the boy adored her, and the man of the house had begun to as well. Richard watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. For a man who had believed power came from control, it stunned him to see that true strength had arrived through letting go. He remembered the boardroom accusations, his sister's sharp criticisms, the society's sneers. They had demanded he cast Grace aside for the sake of appearances. But now, as he stood at the edge of the garden, watching his son dart across the grass with a kite, guided by Grace's patient hand, he realized appearances had never mattered less. One evening, Richard returned home earlier than expected. The sun was sinking low, brushing the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson. He found Grace and Michael in the garden, crouched in the grass. Michael had sticks and string spread out before him, building what looked like a peculiar structure. Grace was laughing, her voice soft but bright, encouraging him to explain his. Richard watched from the terrace, unseen, his heart tugged by a scene so far removed from the sterile dinners of his past. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at a velvet box that had rested in his drawer for weeks. Inside was a ring, nothing ostentatious, nothing dripping with jewels, but a simple, elegant band that spoke more of sincerity than of wealth. He had delayed, waiting for the right moment, the right words, but the truth was, there would never be a perfect time in society's eyes. There would only be now. The next morning, Richard made his decision. He led Grace and Michael into the garden, where the roses Margaret, the late Mrs. Hale, had once planted, were blooming again under Grace's tender care. The marble fountain glistened with morning dew, and the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of lavender. Michael bounded ahead, clutching a math puzzle book, eager to show his latest creation. Richard smiled, then motioned for Grace to stand with him beneath the willow tree at the edge of the lawn. Grace tilted her head, curious. "What's this about?" Richard took a deep breath. His eyes softened as he looked at her. Not as an employer to an employee, but as a man to the woman who had restored his family. "Grace," he began, his voice steady yet trembling with emotion. "You came into this house when it was broken. You brought back laughter, patience, and hope. You didn't just teach Michael math, you taught him to leave. And you..." Grace's lips parted, her eyes glistening, but before she could speak, Richard dropped to one knee. Michael, who had been solving puzzles on the grass, looked up in surprise, his eyes widening. But Richard didn't just turn to Grace. He extended his other hand toward Michael. His voice broke with tenderness. "I'm not just asking Grace to be part of my life. Michael, I'm asking you too. Will you let us be a family?" For a moment, silence hung thick. Grace's hands trembled, tears welling. Michael stared at his father, then at Grace, then back again. His lips quivered before the tears spilled over. "Yes," he cried, his small voice shattering with joy. He threw himself forward, hugging both of them at once. "Yes, yes, yes, I want us to be a family." Grace knelt too, wrapping her arms around Michael, her tears falling freely into his hair. Richard encircled them both, holding them close beneath the shade of the willow. For the first time, the Hale mansion bore witness to something greater than wealth, greater than pride. It bore witness to love, messy, imperfect, healing love. Richard slipped the ring gently onto Grace's finger, his voice low, meant for her alone. Not because society approves, not because it's expected, but because my heart belongs to you. To both of you. Grace's turned into laughter, a sound so pure it startled even herself. Yes, Richard, 1,000 times yes. Michael, beaming, tugged at their hands. Does this mean I can tell my class I have Mama Grace and Papa Richard? Richard chuckled, his chest tightening with emotion. Yes, son, it means exactly that. The rest of the day passed in a haze of joy. The staff, gathered quietly at the windows, witnessed the embrace under the willow tree. For once, no one whispered. Even those who had once doubted now felt the truth radiating from that moment. The boy who had failed every test had finally found his family, and it was stronger than any empire built on wealth alone. That evening, they dined not in the cavernous hall, but in the smaller family dining room, where Grace insisted on helping cook, despite Richard's protests. Michael chattered non-stop about the games he would invent for them to play together. Grace laughed through her tears, and Richard, looking between them, realized that the emptiness that had haunted his life had finally been filled. But the story did not end with a proposal. It was only the beginning. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation of the Hale household deepened. Michael no longer dreaded school, he thrived in it. His teachers reported not only passing grades but enthusiasm. He volunteered answers, made friends, and even helped a struggling classmate with fractions. Richard attended every parent meeting now, sitting proudly beside Grace, who was no longer introduced as staff but as part of the family. The mansion itself shifted. Gone were the days of silence. The study once used only for business meetings now housed Michael's projects, half-built models, math puzzles, colorful charts. Grace introduced family dinners where each person shared something good from their day, a ritual Michael adored. Even Richard, awkward at first, learned to open up, speaking not of profits or mergers but of moments that mattered. One golden afternoon, Richard found himself lying on the grass with Grace and Michael under the same willow tree where he had proposed. Michael had created a math game, a board sketched out with colored markers and dice made from paper. You lose points if you forget to carry the one, he announced gleefully, his small face serious with authority. Grace laughed until her sides hurt, and Richard, fumbling with the rules, ended up being punished with silly dares. For the first time in his life, Richard lost and loved every moment of it. Later, as the sun dipped low, Richard pulled Grace close, his eyes tracing the life around him. I spent years believing money could buy anything, schools, power, but money never bought this. He gestured to Michael, who was giggling as he set up another round of his game. It was you, Grace. You gave us what wealth never could. Grace pressed her forehead to his. Love isn't bought, Richard. It's lived. It's chosen. And they had chosen it. Every single day. On the anniversary of Grace's arrival at the mansion, Richard hosted a small gathering, not for society, not for the board, but for family and staff who had become part of their circle. In a heartfelt speech, he announced Grace not as a maid, nor even just as his fiancée, but as the woman who had given his son back his joy. Michael, standing proudly between them, added in his own words, "She's my mama, and I'm the luckiest boy in the world." Applause filled the room, but it was not the applause of obligation. It was genuine, warm, and full of tears. The final scene unfolded in the garden once more. Stars dotted the night sky, and the fountain whispered softly. Grace carried a tray of cookies, Michael held a board game under his arm, and Richard followed, his arm around Grace's shoulders. They sat together on the patio, roasting marshmallows, playing games, laughing, until the night air grew cool. Michael leaned back against Grace's lap, his eyes sleepy but content. "I used to hate math," he murmured drowsily. "Now it's my favorite." Grace kissed his forehead, her voice a whisper. "That's because you learned that mistakes aren't the end. They're just steps." Richard's gaze softened as he looked at them both. "And because you had the best teacher," he said, his voice low with gratitude. As the fire crackled and laughter echoed against the marble walls, the Hale mansion was no longer a monument to wealth and loneliness. It had become something far greater, a home reborn. And so, beneath the starlit sky, a father, a son, and the woman who had mended them sat together, not as billionaire, child, and maid, but as a family forged not in money, but in love.